everyone. Thank you for joining us again today. We have Gregory Brown, and I will let him give his credentials and introduce himself.
All right. Well, thank you. It's great to be here. I appreciate the invitation. So my name is Greg Brown. I'm a professor in the Department of Kinesiology and Sport Sciences at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. My primary area of teaching is exercise physiology, where I've been teaching that for 20-something years. And I've done a lot of research in the area of nutritional supplements and nutrition on helping athletic performance. And in these last few years, a lot of research looking at sex-based differences in athletic performance, focusing really on prepubertal children.
Oh, wow. That's very poignant right now. We really need that, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's fortunate for you and fortunate for everybody who's been looking into this, because now we all get to expand our education a little bit more. And I mean, so a lot of people who attack sex differences will often go to credentials. And so one thing they might attack is credentials and say, like, well, kinesiology isn't really like, that's not a credible background and stuff. Like, you're not a biologist. So what would you say to that?
You know, it is interesting because we kind of fight that as kinesiologists. Oh, you're not real scientists or whatever. So my bachelor's degree is physical education with an emphasis. It was a pre-physical therapy, which was really an exercise science degree. I took anatomy, physiology, chemistry, physics, a year of general biology, a year of physics, a year of chemistry. I took pathogenic microbiology. So I did a lot of the general science classes that anybody getting a bachelor's degree in the science field is going to take. Yeah. And then going on into my master's degree, my master's was exercise and sports science with an emphasis in exercise physiology. At that time, I took a full year of exercise physiology, which is physiology with specifically how does exercise influence muscle contraction and adaptations, the heart, the lungs, all the different systems. Also a full year of laboratory methods in exercise physiology, plus a semester of just general vertebrate physiology, a semester of endocrinology, a semester of biochemistry. So again, a lot of classes. Plus I took 2 semesters of biomechanics. Wow. So I've got the background in that, and then go on to my doctorate. Again, in working on the PhD, a full year of vertebrate physiology, where half of it really was neurophysiology and the other half of it was looking at the heart, lungs, and muscles again. So put this all together, I've got, 3 semesters at least, probably more like 4 semesters of general physiology, plus, 5 or 6 semesters of exercise physiology. And the thing about exercise physiology, it really is very much applied physiology. And so we look at all of the systems. We don't just focus on the heart. We don't just focus on the lungs. We're trying to look at how it all works together. So from a perspective of looking at the whole human body, I'm extremely well trained in that. And then the other thing I guess I could point out, if somebody questions that, I could say, well, my research has been published in the American Journal of Physiology, the Journal of Applied Physiology, Journal of the American Medical Association. So I can point at also the journals that I've published in, saying, well, they appear to think that I'm qualified to publish there.
Yeah. So, I mean, I challenge anybody with a degree in gender studies to do anything comparable to that.
Yeah.
That is something that a lot of people do seem to forget, though, was something that you mentioned. The body is a whole system that works in concert. You can't just pick apart pieces and expect it to work the same way. But that does seem to be how they do this, and how they argue against biological sex is they try to break the body into pieces and genetics into pieces and all of these things, when really it is the whole system. It has to be.
It is. So you've seen this before. I know a lot of us have talked about it, is kind of the idea that lowering testosterone is going to reduce the difference between males and females. And I know Ross Tucker's talked about that and others. That's really a red herring, because then you get focused on the testosterone concentrations, but it's the effects that testosterone had on all of the systems of the body. It's not just the muscles. It's also the lungs. It's also the heart. It's also neurodevelopment, all these types of things. And you can't really put the genie back in the bottle once the body has developed those types of things.
That's true. Yeah.
And if we look, a lot of the research people are trying to look at, they say, oh, well, you see a little reduction in muscle mass. Okay, but the bones haven't gotten any shorter, right? And the heart
Mm-hmm.
hasn't gotten any smaller, and the lungs haven't gotten any smaller. And when we look at, the male female differences in athletic performance and what causes them, yeah, it's not just one part of the body or one system of the body that gives those male advantages. It's all the
Right.
little pieces that separate males from females that give those differences.
Yeah. And it is kind of an odd thing because they're talking about almost creating like a disability, or as I've talked with people who have disorders of sexual development, and they have said it is kind of like causing a DSD in that person. And we don't do that with anything else. So it's really strange to then try and argue about fairness when it's like you're literally trying to incapacitate somebody to make the situation fair.
Yeah, it really is weird because for years and years and years, the concern is people have been artificially enhancing their performance through
Mm-hmm.
various means of doping. And now we're faced with this, as you mentioned, this way of artificially lowering your performance.
Right.
And one of the big challenges when we look at that, okay, if a man suppresses his testosterone and reduces performance, how do you tease that out from if it's just a man who cuts back on his training and doesn't eat well?
Right.
How could you separate that? And so that's one of the challenges is, do we say, well, they lost performance because of the testosterone reduction, or did they lose performance because they stopped training as well, or they stopped eating as well?
Right. Or even just throwing a competition because they're trying to prove a point. Be like, oh, see, I didn't win first place. See,
Yeah.
so it's, yeah, it is really, it's just, it opens it up to too many, like, what if this and what if that it's just, it doesn't make sense to even
Yeah.
entertain it really.
Well, yeah, because I
Um,
mean, we look at a lot of our, physical fitness type tests. A lot of them really are effort dependent, right? If we
yeah.
want to measure somebody's VO2 max, we are assuming they're giving full effort. Well, if
Hmm.
somebody is incentivized to get a lower VO2 max, so then they just say, oh, that's it, I'm done. It's not like you can get out the
Hmm.
cattle prod and force them to keep running. And so
Right.
we've got that measured VO2 max, or, measuring muscle strength. If somebody's just
Hmm.
like, oh, I can't lift that weight, well, maybe they really couldn't. They're just saying they can't because that would help them qualify
Right.
for a different division. So it's really hard to tease that out. And so, yeah, the whole challenge of this is it's incentivizing underperformance.
Yeah. Recently, Emma Hilton was doing an interview. She's a developmental biologist, and she was talking about how um, it's a lot of people will bring up Michael Phelps as an argument, be like, well, he has an individual advantage. But she was talking about this is a categorical advantage. It's an entirely different sex class. And I'm, I throw that out because again, people will bring up, well, what about weight class? What about height? Height and weight are way more variable than sex is when it comes to sport, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, sex, there is male and there is female. That's it. There's those two categories. And the advantages that males get because they're male, they outclassify everything else. All right. I mean, a 10% advantage in running simply because you're male. All right. Well, that's
Mhm.
a lot more difference than we're going to see between a 12-year-old and a 13-year-old. But if you have, 11 and 12-year-old age group and a 13, 14-year-old age group, that's not going to be a 10% difference in performance right there.
Right.
Um, Generally speaking, if we look at, say, strength, where a male is lifting 30% more than a female, right? Then that's matched for weight. And so
Yeah.
again, if you go from high school to college wrestling, there's high school to college lifting, you don't see this 30% improvement in strength just because you switch divisions like that. And so the
Hmm.
sex category, really, there's two options there. Whereas in high school wrestling, I think we've got 14 different weight categories where you've got the
Yeah.
lightest weight and then move on up to your heaviest weight. And that heaviest weight category is something like 220 to 285 pounds. Whereas, some of the other weight classes, I think it's like 106 to 113. You get these,
Yeah.
and really that's kind of arbitrary. Why
Hmm.
113 is the cutoff point, or why 115, or whatever is the cutoff point. Somebody's looked at it and said, well, those are good ways to separate the categories. But again, you got 14 boys weight classes. You've got one male category, one female category.
Yeah.
And I really like it's John Pike that has really published well on this whole category advantage. And the idea is, okay, if you are male, you have the potential for the male category advantage. That doesn't mean that we're going to say, well, if you're an underperforming male, you can then compete in female sports. No, if you're
Right.
an underperforming male, or maybe you're performing as hard as you can, but you're just not that good, that doesn't mean that
Mm-hmm.
then you get to default into female sports. You're still male. You'll compete in the male category.
And honestly, just from the perspective of someone who did have gender dysphoria, as we call it, since childhood, um, it reinforces that belief that you don't belong with your sex class, that you are now so unlike your sex that you go belong with the other sex in something that is so uniquely exemplary of bodies as sports.
Yeah.
And like how much does that really hammer in that something is not wrong with you and you don't fit in? So it really, I don't think, is a kind thing to do in any way, really.
Yeah, yeah, and that really gets into psychology and issues like
Yeah.
that. But it really is because you're trying to tell someone. I don't know. Honestly, when I was a kid, it was an insult. Oh, you go play with the girls.
Yeah.
There really was an insult, and I think there's still some of that where if somebody
Mm-hmm.
says, well, your identification doesn't fit with the other boys, therefore you go play with the
Right.
girls, or your identification doesn't fit with the other girls, you should go play with the boys. There are still challenges with that, and I don't think that's great because my view on this, we are all given our body, right?
Mm-hmm.
Evolution, creation, whatever you choose on that, we have our body. And part of our challenge is learning to accept that what we can and can't do with our body, right?
Right.
I'm never going to be I have terrible hand-eye coordination. So throwing sports are not something that I'm ever going to be good at. No matter what I want to do, I just don't catch that well, right? But I was a decent distance runner when I was younger because I had endurance and I could do that and it doesn't require tremendous amounts of coordination.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good point. We don't have people identify into throwing sports and like, you're doing a great job, even though they're not doing a great
Yeah,
job.
yeah.
So because yeah.
And
Um
that is one of the great things about sports is what we're looking for in sports is we have competition and people
mhm,
talk about, oh, it's for fun. And yeah, it is. But talk to anybody in competition. They want to win, right?
right.
Even the kid on the team that's the worst on the team, he still wants to win, right? Or
Yeah,
she wants to win. And so there's that competition point, and the point of competition is to find the best in that category in that sport. That's
right.
why, I mean, how many dozens of different sports were there in the Olympics? Because we
Right.
want to find the best 50-meter backstroke versus the 50-meter butterfly and things like that.
Mhm.
And we find the man and find the woman. So those categories give us all these opportunities to find that place where they excel and they're their best. But then
Right.
again, some of us are just not that gifted or talented to be the best.
That would be me. I'm
Yeah.
terrible in most sports. um, but you brought up age earlier, and that brings me to a few different sports actually, in which we've not just seen cross sex identification, but we've also seen some concerns with what seems to be cross age identification, where in skateboarding, I think the guy was in his 40s and he competed against a 13-year-old girl in the women's category and beat her, obviously, because of like the hip and Q angle and things like that.
Yeah.
Like, factors into skateboarding. Also, in swimming in Canada, there is a 50-year-old man who is identifying into the girls category, swimming against 12-year-old girls. So yeah, this is really strange, this territory that we've gone into.
It really is. And I mean, it really makes us question, or it's trying to make us question things that can be very objectively measured. Again,
Mm-hmm.
sex is really, really objectively measured. And yeah, there's male or there's female. And then age, well, we can look and see when you were born and really
Right.
identify how old you are. It's very objective. It's not judgmental. It's just that's
Mm-hmm.
how old you are. And if we start disregarding those types of things, it's going to have a lot of problems. Again, in sports categories, if we start allowing, oh, well, you're not a very good college athlete, so come back and play high school. Or you're not
Yeah.
that of a high school athlete, oh, you can go play Little League. If you look back, there's been years in the past where there's been a child show up for World Little League World Series and has been disqualified because they were the wrong age.
Wow.
And so, and becomes this big thing that you hit in the news. I remember there was some late 90s, early 2000s where there was a 13-year-old playing on the 12 and under team, and his team lost all of their wins and had to forfeit everything. And so you had another team that suddenly gets into the Little League World Series. And
Wow.
but that's the way it should be. If the
Mm-hmm.
rules say you have to be 12 by this day and no older, that's what the rules should be. And so we start
Yeah.
disregarding that. We're going to have all sorts of people losing when they shouldn't, to
Mm-hmm.
losing to people who shouldn't even be in that competition.
Right. And it also does away with the idea of fairness. The whole concept of fairness is now like just up to whomever feels more hurt
Yeah.
or what have you, or more left out. So it's odd.
Yeah. I think it was John Pike. It might have been Ross Tucker. I can't remember, but one of those two was talking about it, and how, in bicycling, you have a bicycle and they don't allow motors on your bike. It's got to be a human powered
Yeah.
bike. So now do we suddenly start saying, oh, well, okay, you're pretty good, so we'll let you have a 50cc motor on your bike so you can compete with other people, right?
Yeah.
We don't do that, and if you are
Hmm.
in motocross, say, and you've got a 450cc motorcycle, they don't let you ride in the 225 class, even if you say, oh, well, I won't use the throttle, full throttle, right? Or
Yeah,
I'll put an engine governor on it. No, you've got the 450cc bike, you ride in the 450cc class.
that's true. So when it comes to these advantages that we see even in boys um, who are going into sports before puberty and they're competing against girls, we're still seeing those advantages in some things like running, I think, and throwing.
Yep.
Not in swimming, though, weirdly.
So actually, we do see the advantages in swimming also.
Oh, we
It's
do.
they're
Oh, okay.
smaller. Yeah. So with running, so I've published on this last year, and Jack Senefield and Sandra Hunter published on this last year, showing that in kids in the running before puberty, boys are 3 to 7% faster than the girls, depending whether you're
Okay.
looking like 8 and under, 9 and 10-year-old age group, and which specific event. And then also see this in throwing. I've got a paper in review right now. I'm hoping I get the revisions all finished and it finally gets accepted, where actually the differences are huge. In
Oh, wow.
javelin, the 8 and under boys are throwing like 30% further than the girls, and
Whoa.
9 and 10-year-old boys are throwing 23% further than the girls. And
Oh,
that's in
my God.
javelin, which, I mean, that's a huge difference. In
Yeah.
shot put, the 8 and under boys are somewhere around 20% further than the girls. By 9 years old, it's about a 7% difference. So it's kind of interesting with
Hmm.
that. Jumping seems to be about a 7% difference. If we look at swimming, so Jack Senefield published on this, and it was very interesting. If you look at the fastest 5 girls in the U.S. Age under 10, and the fastest 5 boys, the girls were faster. But then you look at
Hmm.
the 10th to 50th ranked boys and girls, there was no difference. But at age 10, the boys were now the fastest 5 boys were 2.5% faster than the girls, and the 10th
Oh,
through 50th ranked boys were 1% faster than the girls. And so just
interesting.
kind of interesting, a little change there. And then I've got another paper in review looking at this, looking at the National Club Swimming Association Championships, where it gets interesting. If you look at it statistically, the boys were faster than the girls in 8 out of the 12 events. So basically,
Hmm.
looking at the average performance of boys, average performance of the girls, the boys were statistically faster than the girls in 8 out of the 12 events. But girls, the very fastest girl was faster than the fastest boy in 8 out
Huh.
of 12 events.
Do you think that might be because girls might be physically maturing a little faster, quote unquote, than the boys, and so they're reaching an athletic peak a little sooner than the boys might be?
So there's a couple of things that probably go into this. One of them, even before puberty, boys have more lean body mass, but
Mm-hmm.
actually having a little more body fat gives you more buoyancy in swimming. So you don't have to
Mm,
fight sinking as much. So basically you float better. So then you can put more
okay.
of your effort into swimming. That may provide a little bit. There also seem to be some social factors where more girls participate in competitive swimming than boys, because the boys are off playing
Oh,
football and hockey and soccer,
I
and there's
see.
just more sports for the boys to kind of be distracted in. And so
Mm-hmm.
girls tend to concentrate a little more into swimming. Girls seem to actually enjoy the swimming practices more and probably have a better stroke because of it. So they have a better
Mm.
technique combined with a little better buoyancy, helps them close the gap compared to the boys, where the boys are in essence just muscling through.
Yeah.
And then when
And
you hit puberty, then you see the huge increase in muscle mass where the boys suddenly start streaking ahead of the girls because,
Mhm.
well, they've got so much more muscle mass that they continue to muscle through.
Yeah. I've read some papers that um, basically come to the conclusion that girls get a lot of reward out of having a sport to their own. There's a lot of psychological benefit to being in a sport, whether it's a team sport or more of a competitive sport like swimming. And basically, having boys come into that disrupts it because now suddenly here's this boy and he's able to compete at a level that they can't reach. And I think that's true now of like pretty much every sport because we've seen boys come into every sport, particularly volleyball in schools. So is there anything that you've studied about the psychology behind that and how that would work?
Yeah, so I haven't really looked into the psychology of it. I've talked to student athletes about it. Now, at the college level and even at the high school level, a lot of boys and girls enjoy training together,
Mm-hmm.
but the girls still want the girls' locker room
Right.
because of the comfort level in the locker room. And the girls want to compete against other girls because they know it's a fair competition, right? They don't want to
Mm-hmm.
be competing against the boys because suddenly they're like, well, this is unfair. It's not even going to matter if I give my best effort because I can't win. And that's a definite psychological thing. Quite honestly, I think we saw that in the Olympics with the Italian boxer against the Algerian boxer in the women's boxing. She knew she was boxing a male, and I think she went in with that
Yeah.
holding her back. And so then when the boxer hit her and she felt it, she was like, "Oh my gosh, I've never been hit so hard. I'm going to just end this
Yeah.
rather than get hurt." Probably good choice on her, but I think there's definitely some psychology that plays into that.
Yeah.
And this is where we get these kind of interesting dynamics because a lot of the people arguing for including trans women into women's sports are stating it's good for the trans woman's psychological health, but they are kind of ignoring the psychological health of the other women. And if you listen to
Absolutely.
Paula Scanlon, you listen to Riley Gaines, you listen to these other girls that have had to share a sport or a locker room with boys, it was traumatic to them. It was not a
Yeah.
positive experience.
Yeah. Unfortunately, a lot of these trans identified males don't seem to be very respectful either. Um, I mean, shocker, but
Yeah.
like they're coming into this sport knowing what they know, and surprisingly, they're not the nicest people, it turns out. Um, but yeah, it does seem to really impact the psychology of these female athletes. Um, I watched the some of the matches, some clips because a lot of them were copyright struck and taken
Yeah.
down. Of the I think it was the Taiwanese boxer and the
Okay.
Algerian boxer, and like my uncle was a boxer, so I kind of have a background with boxing in it. Their form was not what I would call competitive. And the women, on the other hand, they had really tight form. They were guarding the face really well. They were like trying to work the body when they could and that sort of thing. So, and their footwork was great. Um, but when I was watching the men, or I guess, the male fighters who may or may not have a disorder, it's unclear.
Yeah.
Their form was more loose, they were way overextending, and the punches were not as tight. So it really did not seem like a fair fight or even like on the same competitive level, but they were just able to get those headshots in, and it just, like, you could tell was ringing people's bells.
Yeah. I mean, part of that is, I mean, if you look at the Algerian boxer and the Taiwanese boxer, they very much had male pattern body height. One of them
Mm-hmm.
was 5'9", the other one was 5'10", which are pretty much average male body heights. And so they had greater reach than the women.
Yeah.
And in boxing, people will talk about that, how much of an advantage is reach, because you can start hitting your opponent before they can get into you. And so then the shorter opponent has to work on getting underneath their hands to get a good fight in, type of thing. And so the reach definitely was an advantage. And if you combine that with, men that can punch 162% harder than a woman, So they've got a greater reach. And even if their punching power isn't the best for a male, it's still a lot more than the female. So yeah, they
Yeah.
land one punch, they're ringing the lady's bell, and she's really feeling it.
Yeah.
Whereas, the women are throwing a punch at the males, and the males are like, yeah, I've been hit by like that all the time because they fight against women. So
Yeah. It was definitely interesting because one of the boxers in particular, the female boxers, had said, "Oh well, I fought against that particular fighter. I think it was the Algerian fighter before, and had a victory. So I'm confident that I'll be able to come out of it on top." And she did not. She lost. Um, it again kind of begs the question: is it because maybe that fighter wasn't trained as well before? Is it because this fighter was throwing that particular match that may have been qualifying? So it really is it's suspicious, I would
yeah,
say.
and that's one of the things that if you look at the trans women competing in women's sports, any loss they have, there's going to be an
Hmm.
asterisk by it.
Yeah.
If you are the woman that beat that person, is it going to be because they threw the fight or threw the race
Hmm.
or held back or something just so they could make it look more competitive, or you really earn that victory? And as an athlete, you hate that. You hate that. You hate the idea that the only reason you won is because the other person didn't give their best, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I would imagine that would be really demoralizing.
Yeah, yeah. It's frustrating to you because then you just don't get the joy of that victory. And
Hmm.
honestly, though, I wonder about the trans women. How much joy can they take from the victory when they know they have an advantage,
Yeah.
right? Um, my son was a high
Yeah.
school wrestler, and I could wrestle against him when he was a freshman and beat him. Well, yeah, because I outweighed him by 50 pounds. So he could throw a great move at me, but then I'd push him down on the
Yeah.
ground. I didn't take any joy in those. It was just having fun, right?
Right.
And he didn't have any fun when he pinned me because he knew I let him, type of thing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Exactly. And when you bring up the joy and things like that, unfortunately, like I said, we have seen some things like some of those athletes coming out and bragging in a really crass way about, oh, I caused a skull fracture and it was funny and I loved it. And, or like the taunting and the teasing with the swimming and things like that. And it's again, it goes back to the women know this isn't fair.
yeah,
They were not asked, and these men are just allowed to come in and take over this space and then laugh at them for it. And it's really just not nice all around to everybody.
yeah, and it really does. Just a lot of the things that we say are good about sport, it really devalues all those things. I mean, if you look
Right.
at the Olympic motto, right? Faster, stronger, together, those types of things. Um, but there's also the code of conduct for athletes. And
Mm-hmm.
when you start allowing people to go into categories that they shouldn't be in, it starts just eroding that code of conduct and starts just devalue it. It becomes professional wrestling versus like high school or college wrestling, right?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And it really kind of reminds me too of like the melodrama that we can see in like WWE of like, all the chair throwing and the name calling and that sort of thing. But it's real. So
Right.
it's like, it's real and it actually is hurting people. And it's impacting sports in a major way. So have you been able to offer testimony or anything like that to protect the integrity of sports?
I have. I've been fortunate. Going back to 2019, I think it was when I saw a news item about Selena Soul and the other ladies there in Connecticut suing the Connecticut Interscholastic Athletic Conference. And I
Yeah.
saw that they were represented by Alliance Defending Freedom. And so I contacted Alliance Defending Freedom and said, hey, I'm an exercise physiologist. I know sex matters in sports. Can I be helpful? And so I wrote an expert report for the Seoul versus CIAC case, which
Hmm.
then led to an expert report for the case in Idaho defending their Save Women's Sports law and the Hecox versus Little case, and both of those are still going on.
Oh,
And then
wow.
I've also written expert reports for West Virginia, for Tennessee. I was working with the state of Florida, but the judge actually dismissed that suit before it went to the point of even getting expert reports.
Wow.
I'm working with the state of Utah right now, and I've also worked with the state of Arizona, where I've put in an expert report, and I really go through all the science. And the three main points of my expert report are: number one, there are important biological differences between males and females, meaning men and women men and boys versus girls and women. So there's important
Hmm.
sex-based differences. Those differences give males inherent athletic advantages in pretty much every sport that relies on strength, speed, endurance, power, agility, those types of things. And then the third real main point is that those differences are not erased because of a
Hmm.
transgender identity with or without using cross-sex hormones, puberty blockers, those types of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I thank you so much for giving your expert testimony because we definitely need more of that. I think mostly it's that people aren't really aware of what's going on in their states and that this is kind of getting snuck in. Um, One thing, too, that a lot of people don't consider, but we've seen kind of in a roundabout way with women standing on the podium with their children and things like that, is that female athletes also have another challenge when they're competing. And that's just with our physiology, our menstrual cycles, how we have to control our diets and things like that when we're readying ourselves for competition. It's totally different for men from men. And um, I remember you mentioned something about nutrition earlier when you were introducing yourself.
Yeah, yeah. So there, it's such a great point that the female ovulatory cycle, typically 28 days, changes in hormones over the course of those days. It influences maybe very subtly, but hey, victory in sports a lot of times is just the sum of a couple of small differences. So it
Yeah,
can influence a woman's ability to use carbohydrate or fat during exercise, which can then influence how fast she can produce ATP to fuel the muscles, how long she can exercise before she fatigues, those types of things. There's also the water retention that comes on and the feeling of bloating and those types of things. And okay, not being a woman, I can't say for sure, but I've been married now for over 30 years. I had an older sister and stuff. Some cycles are worse than others, right?
yeah.
And so
Hmm.
you never can predict when that's going to happen. Is it going to be a really, middle schmerz or a rough period or
Right.
something like that right at the time of competition? That's
Hmm.
something that no male is ever going to have to deal with.
Right.
Even a male who is on testosterone suppression and taking estrogen, it doesn't go through all of the female ovulatory cycle things. And so that's not
Yeah.
going to be something they're going to have to deal with. Um, and then it gets interesting because also with the ovulatory cycle, there's changes in tendon stiffness and ligament stiffness that can
Oh,
influence a
wow.
woman's susceptibility to injury.
That makes sense, but
And
it's also surprising.
yeah, yeah. And again, these are the things that a lot of people don't really think of is all of
Yeah.
these things that I don't know, as men we don't know about, and as women you just
Hmm.
accept as that's being part of a woman, I guess.
Right.
That can all influence athletic performance, which is honestly a lot of female athletes are on oral contraception to regulate
Hmm.
their ovulatory cycle, so they don't
Right.
have heavy cycles or light cycles, and so that hopefully they can time things with competition a little bit better and time their nutrient intake so they know at the times when they really need to focus on carbohydrates or really need to focus on getting extra fluids and those types of things. And it's a whole series of stuff that, again, male athletes just don't have to worry about.
Yeah, I had a coach in, I think it was my sophomore year of high school, and he was teaching biology, but he had previously coached swimming competitively, and I think he said he had trained an Olympic swimmer at one point. But he was talking about how important her diet was and how she had to have all of this understanding of like female biology and anatomy and everything in order to just be able to track her diet and just have a competition ready body just by making sure she was eating right throughout her training. And it didn't really hit me how important that was until now.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. So it's interesting. If you go back to, I think it was 1992, where they first identified what they call the female athlete triad. which is
Hmm.
where a female athlete, generally you would see this in endurance athletes, but you could also see this in gymnasts or cheerleaders, people who are really watching their calorie intake. So they're not getting enough calories, which then, because they're not getting enough calories, they have this energy deficiency, and so that interferes with their ovulatory cycle. Because in essence, the body kind of goes into starvation mode and says, well, we're not
Right.
getting enough calories to sustain a pregnancy, so we better stop having a normal ovulatory cycle, which then interferes with the secretion of estrogen and progesterones and all the things during the ovulatory cycle, which then leads to weakened bones.
Hmm.
And so, some of the early cases of this, they were finding high school, college female athletes that had the bone health of a 70-year-old osteoporotic woman. And again, it all started
Wow.
with not getting enough calories for the amount of exercise they're doing, right? And again,
That's
this goes back,
incredible.
yeah, so 1992. So what is that? Almost 40 years now that we've known
Wow.
about the female athlete triad.
Yeah.
And again, men can experience a similar type of thing where if they're not getting enough calories, it can interfere with hormones and interfere with health. But again, they don't have the
Hmm.
ovulatory cycle to interfere with. And
Right.
so, it's just interesting that we've known these types of things for so long. And yet some people seem to just dismiss that to the side and saying, well, we need to include these trans women for
Hmm.
kindness while ignoring what we've known biologically.
Right. And the other thing is when we go back to kids, when we go back to competition that's under puberty age, we'll say like 10 and under, some girls do start going through puberty and experiencing those changes earlier. I was one of those girls. I started going through my whole puberty journey at 6. So like
Oh,
it was really strange to be going through this whole thing and all of these changes and all these other kids weren't experiencing it. And I could feel like days where I just felt sick or whatever and didn't understand it. And culturally, my family was very uneducated on those particular things. They came from Cuba, and so we just didn't talk about them. So it
yeah.
was like, so it, my family was just like, oh, just get over it. It's fine, that sort of thing. I was like, but something's up, like. So, yeah, we do see that though in other countries where we do have like increased rates of DSDs or girls in certain populations who are more likely to go into precocious puberty and things like that. Um, so yeah, have you seen any of that in your research and how that impacts um, sports performance?
So that is a really interesting question. And so one of the challenges, right, looking at sports performance, and there's this great graph on the website Boys versus Women, where he
Mhm.
tracks the difference in running speed from like 3 years old up through 80 years old or whatever.
Wow.
And you see it at about age 11, the difference between boys and girls is as small as it ever gets. And part of that is because girls typically hit puberty about a year before boys. And one of
Mm.
the things that you would look at for that, they look at what they call peak height velocity. In other words, when you get your growth spurt. And
Mm-hmm.
average of averages, girls' growth spurt is 10 and a half, and boys is 11 and a half. And so 11-year-old girls pretty much narrow the height gap between boys and girls. And
Yeah.
they can probably compete closer to boys than at any other time in age. And then boys hit the puberty and just accelerate off the chart type of thing.
Yeah.
But you've got that little brief period where the girls have hit puberty and have grown a little bit and are closer to, I guess, maybe possibly you could say competitively equal to boys for that
Mm-hmm.
one little period of time.
Yeah.
Um, and it gets to be a challenge, though. One of the things we've seen just overall is the average age of puberty for girls is getting lower. And
Mm-hmm.
because, well, problems with obesity, but also just better nutrition, plenty of calories and stuff.
Yeah.
So girls are starting to hit, not uncommon to find a 9-year-old girl who is
Yeah.
starting to having a menstrual cycle and stuff like that, which, again, I can't imagine. I feel bad for the girls when I was in middle school, as a boy. I remember the girls that started maturing a little bit earlier, and
Yeah.
the boys were not exactly cool with it. Well, we thought
No.
we were cool with it, but we were really jerks, right?
Yeah, sometimes.
And but again, that is going to influence athletic performance, because another thing, some of these girls, they start to grow breasts, which apparently can be
Yeah.
problematic when you're exercising, right?
Yeah, and depending on size and stuff like that, plus your hips get wider, it can
Yeah.
really mess with your balance. I used to
Hmm.
love skating,
Yeah.
and then puberty hit, and suddenly my balance was off on skates. And
Yeah.
then as I got older, I got back into skating. And then, I had a bunch of hormone therapy and things like that for endometriosis, which changed how my body was shaped again. And so
Yeah.
then I had to get used to that all over again. And then I had a baby, and then things changed again. So we're
Yeah.
just constantly in flux as women, I
Yeah.
think.
It really is. And a great point that you mentioned about that, about how, when puberty hit, you lost interest in skating. We do see that at puberty, girls tend to drop out of sports at a much higher rate than boys do.
Hmm.
Um, and again, part of it is the changes in puberty. There, you can call it social things, other stuff like that. But I don't see how including males into female sports is going to help encourage girls to stay in sports.
Right.
If you're putting
If
male body
anything,
there, yeah,
yeah, it's like encouraging girls to just, see, oh, okay, so we can be replaced.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's no sense competing if the boys are going to take the trophies. So just
Right.
go play with your Barbies or whatever. So it's almost a regret.
Yeah,
I can see it being regressive type thing there. So
absolutely. Recently there was an article about two boys who were suing, I think, New Hampshire, because they were banned from competing with girls. And there was no mention of the girls in the article.
yeah,
None.
and if you look at that for all of these cases I've been involved with, um, and I really try not to look into it too much because I don't want to be going after the individuals. But when the ACLU or some of these other groups are putting out their press releases, yeah, they're really focusing on these boys that identify as girls, and how they're not being allowed to participate in sports. But there's no information coming out saying, yeah, but what about the other 13 girls on the team that now have to share a
Yeah.
locker room with a boy? What about the other 13 girls on the team that now know that they can't perform as well as this boy, so they're competing for second place on the team versus being the champion starter?
Right. Or even just, being able to find out where you are and have your own accomplishments on the team in general, just versus a fair competition. Not necessarily being first, but at least you can say that it was a fair team that you qualified for. And how many people can even say that?
Yeah,
Um, so we saw in the Tokyo Olympics, I believe, Laurel Hubbard was a male weightlifter. He took the spot of a female Samoan lifter who got through recovery from domestic violence through weightlifting. And this was her one shot at qualifying for the Olympics, and he took her spot.
yeah, yeah. And we talked about age earlier, but Laurel Hubbard, a 43-year-old trans woman, competing in a sport where the average age of the competitors is 25,
Right.
displaced an 18-year-old indigenous woman. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, the injustices that were heaped upon injustices there are just
Absolutely.
insane.
And the same people who cry about inclusivity did not cry for her inclusivity,
Yeah,
because she has the privilege, the existing privilege of being a woman, and oh, he has to identify into it. And it was like, okay, so by declaration, because he says so, now he gets to take this indigenous domestic abuse survivor spot from the Olympics. It was mind blowing. I could not believe what I was reading when I saw that case.
yeah, yeah. It's just interesting. Um, yeah, you kind of got to wonder what happened. Did I go to sleep and Rip Van Winkle or something like that?
Yeah, it does feel that way sometimes. It's like, what is happening, and why are there so many people playing along with this? Like,
Yeah.
what where's the email that I missed? I don't get it. Um Another interesting thing that we saw in this Olympics, though, talking about female physiology, was there's actually, I believe, one competitor. Oh, I can't remember the sport it was. It might have been shot put. She was pregnant.
Yes.
And so, like, that's something else that males don't have to contend with is pregnancy. And a lot of these women often have to choose, do I want to be pregnant or do I want to be competitive?
Yeah.
And so this woman, she decided she was going to do both and she did
And
very well.
it's really awesome to see that. It really is to see these amazing things that women can do. Whether it's women winning medals while pregnant or winning medals not too long after having a baby or just engaging in
Yeah.
sports. My daughter-in-law is supposed to run a marathon this Saturday. She had a baby in January. And so
Wow.
she's been training up for it. And this is kind of her reward to herself type of thing. And I'm just amazed that she's able to do that, which is
Yeah.
really just, again, these are the type of female accomplishments that we really should be championing and putting out on the news type of thing to show how amazing our female athletes are.
It's weird though, because they almost suppress those stories because, oh, it's so heteronormative. We can't. And it's like, what? Like, that's incredible. Like, here's this woman overcoming an incredible challenge. Like, you don't want to train for marathons when you have a baby. Like, it's
Yeah,
hard to be a mother and to recover physically and to be training. That's incredible. To be pregnant and be going through all of those changes and training to where you can get to the Olympics, that's
yeah,
incredible.
it is. It really
Just
is.
to just to be able to compete and get on any of these teams, even recreationally, that's something not everybody does.
Yeah,
And we definitely need to be celebrating women and girls who are able to do that at all.
yeah. And again, that comes back to what we were talking about earlier about how we have sporting categories. We have the girls and women's, the female sporting category, so we can celebrate these amazing accomplishments of female athletes. And again, maybe it's just the local team at the YMCA that got the championship in the women's division. Well, those six ladies should be really proud of themselves because they did a really cool thing, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There are no small victories
Yeah,
with things like that. Especially again, because we don't have the easiest time when it comes to being athletic.
yeah.
Our physiology does not lend super well to that. So just the fact that we're able to overcome that and accomplish anything in athletics is amazing.
It is. It is. Well, and again, if you look at the history of female sports, right? There was a time when they thought women shouldn't engage in jumping sports because their uterus might fall out. Or, there was concern, oh, women shouldn't engage in weightlifting. It'll ruin their ability to have children. These types of just crazy ideas that we had about women participating in sports. And the first woman to run the Boston Marathon, there's this famous picture of the marathon director trying to run her down and yank off her runner number because she wasn't,
What?
but they thought that was to protect the woman. They were
Wow.
afraid that it would
Yeah.
ruin her ability to have children if she ran that far. And we've learned all these great things that no, women can do amazing things. We need to give them the
Yeah.
opportunity as women to compete against other women.
And now we've gone in the complete opposite direction. Where we're like, nobody cares about the women. They can just,
Yeah.
like, they can, if you don't like it, leave, which is not fair. I hate that we're getting to a point where we are telling women and girls, if you don't agree with these males who are coming in, don't compete. I don't believe that's a fair thing to say.
No, no. And I mean, I realized it would make a great social point. We saw that, I think it was 4 or 5 girls in West Virginia that stepped out of the shot put ring rather than compete against a male who identified as a girl. But you also see what happened to those girls. They were suspended, right? And there
Right.
was a court case to actually get them back on the team. And, if you look at somebody competing for a high school championship or a college championship or an Olympic championship or even the local YMCA championship, they've put in the work to get there. And then to ask them to sacrifice all of that to make a point that one shouldn't have to be made. We know
Right.
there's differences between males and females. We know. And we know that just because somebody identifies as a female doesn't erase male advantages.
Right.
But to ask them to sacrifice all of that to make a point really is unfair. It's not treating them fairly.
Right. And it ignores all of the fair competition they had up to that point as
Yeah,
well,
yeah,
because they're still able to compete against other women regardless of the one that they didn't compete against, the one man that they didn't compete against. So it disregards that, and it disregards all of their hard work. And like on the one hand, it's like, well, we need to just make women's sports again, but then we're going to have the same problem
Mm-hmm.
until we like codify something to just protect the integrity of women's sports.
Yeah, and I think that's really the answer right now is we need to build very solid barriers around. Okay, to compete in female sports, you must be female, right? And it'd be very simple, especially at the elite level, a cheek swab. Everybody gets their cheek
Right.
swab. If you have XX chromosomes, you're eligible to compete in the female sport category. If you have XY chromosomes, you're not. And then if
Mm-hmm.
somebody says, but I think I'm female or I was raised in female, well, then you can do more testing to find
Right.
out if they have a disorder of sex development where they experience no androgenization, no male advantage, something.
Mm-hmm.
But 99.98% of the time or something that cheek swab would tell us, right?
I'm
Which
so
is really,
glad you
really
got that
accurate.
statistic right. So many people get that statistic totally wrong.
Yeah.
That percentage. And so that's comforting to me personally because we do so much work with people with these disorders and so much education on that. We had so many live arguments fairly recently at a conference
Yeah.
about biological sex and disorders of sexual development. And there were so many people who just had no idea what they were talking about.
Well, yeah. And I actually think it was on one of your videos where it was pointed out that, okay, intersex is a disorder of sex development, but all
Mm-hmm.
disorders of sex development are not intersex.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an important point because intersex really means at birth the sex is ambiguous,
Right.
right? And that is a
Mm-hmm.
tiny, tiny, tiny percent of the population. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
the disorder of sex development may be as something as the opening of the urethra is not perfectly aligned with
Right.
where it should be.
Yeah. Right. And they've just dragged in so many different disorders and things like malformations or some structure might be missing or something. They're trying to drag in PCOS now,
Yeah,
and I've even heard of endometriosis being dragged in, and it's like, what are you doing? Like, who is this helping? It's not helping anybody.
yeah. Polycystic ovary syndrome or endometriosis. There's no question those are women's health issues,
Yeah.
right? And you look at Klinefelter syndrome or Turner syndrome, people with
Right.
those conditions, they're not ambiguous whether they're male or female.
Exactly. Exactly. And it's just odd to see people just like trying to pull in every it's like clear that there's some kind of agenda or motivation behind it. Like they're trying to inflate the number or
Mm-hmm.
something to make it seem like, well, anybody could be any sex at any moment. There was one guy that we debunked who said that there's no way to know if you have ovaries right now. It's like, well, I'm pretty sure a woman who's menstruating knows that she has ovaries
Yeah,
right
yeah,
now.
yeah. Ask any
So,
girl that's gone through puberty, and she'll tell you if she's got over.
yeah,
So
it was really something to see. There's a whole thing of people just totally missing what they can clearly see with their eyes, what we've known in biology for decades.
yeah,
Um, yeah.
and you probably get that a lot with people are saying, "Oh, well, that's high school biology,"
Yes.
but it's still true. The basic biology is still
Right.
true.
Right. We also learn the difference between oxygen and carbon dioxide in
Yeah,
high school biology, but that doesn't make it any less true or any less concrete of a difference.
yeah, yeah,
So that's a non-argument. It's
yeah,
like, okay. Like
yeah. It's
so
like saying addition it isn't true because of calculus.
yeah,
You've got to add before you can learn calculus. It's just you've got to
right.
think that way.
There are foundational things to learning and foundational things just in life
Mm-hmm.
that, exist in order for other things to exist. So I mean, you can see that on a genetic level with the genetic cascade that goes through to develop one sex or the other.
Yeah,
So it's kind of amazing that these people just love to throw out these things that try to destroy the idea or the concept but it
yeah,
doesn't do anything. So
yeah. I want to say the term is obfuscation. I'm probably using that
yeah.
wrong, but it's just trying to make everything confusing, right? It's
Yeah.
trying to confuse people and try and make them think that it's not as clear cut as it is.
Hmm.
Which, I mean, it's a common tactic you see in lots of different
Oh,
realms
yeah.
where they try and make it all seem confusing. But unfortunately, this is confusing something that doesn't need to be confusing.
Right. And the other thing is, women already have our health and our biology kind of obfuscated. There's not a ton of information out there. I mean, I've met women who have no idea how to like how to identify different parts of our physiology and things like that. Like, oh, well, the clitoris and the urethra, it's the same thing, or the vagina is the same thing as the labia. And it's like, no,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, I used to be one of them. Again, culturally, it was just something we didn't talk about. And like, my grandmother was under this like weird superstitious belief that I'm still having to try and wrestle her out of, where she believes that if you don't like wash yourself every day, like 3 times a day, you will grow worms in your vagina. And I'm like, no, that's not, it's self-cleaning. Like, we can talk about this.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
I think so. But she's in her 80s, and the fact that she has had the self-discipline to do that every day, I'm surprised she honestly doesn't get like a ton of yeast infections or something like at this point,
Yeah.
because she's
Yeah.
really decimating the natural like biochemistry in there. But yeah, it's just that like that kind of culture combined with gynecology telling women, well, you don't need to know that because that's not medically relevant.
Yeah.
Like, I asked what middle smers was, and they just told me it was mid-cycle pain. They didn't tell me it was because of ovulation.
Yeah. Yeah.
So like, so, yeah, like, hopefully, I don't know if you know personally from training athletes or not, but hopefully female athletes are at least being educated on the different parts of the cycle and things like that.
And that really varies a lot, probably from school to school and team to team. I tell my students that they, if they're the athletic trainer or they're the coach, they need to find a way to be able to have these conversations with their female athletes to
Mm-hmm.
let them know, one, it's normal, and two, it's okay. Let's see if we can find ways to work around it, and also to know when's the time to go see the doctor to find out if something's really wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, for all you know, you're destroying your bone health if you're not taking care of your diet properly.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, and I mean, like a big thing I tell my students when we talk about the female athlete triad, it's not a normal response to exercise to stop having a menstrual cycle. But a
mm-hmm.
lot of female athletes, they're actually happy if they stop having a menstrual
Right.
cycle.
Yeah.
But that's an abnormal response. That means they're exercising too much, they're not eating enough,
Right.
they're setting themselves up for future problems. And so you have to let the girls know about that. Um,
Right.
I had a couple of students this last year, or the last couple of years, they've been doing some research on the knowledge of female athletes, about the female athlete triad. And they found it's okay, we've known about this again since 1992, but a lot of these high school age girls still have these myths about, oh, if you stop your cycle, that means that you're adapting to training. No, that means you're actually hurting yourself. Or
Yeah.
they're overly focused on maintaining a body weight or something like that. And so
Mm-hmm.
these are challenges. And again, working with the female athletes, we need to be aware of those conversations that need to be had. As a former female athlete, you probably know about the myths that go around in the locker room.
Mm.
You've got to be careful of those because some of
Yeah,
those
you
myths are
do.
yeah,
And
they're downright
man, some of
dangerous.
those girls will tell you that with so much confidence that you're like, there's no way they're lying about that. And then 10 years later, you find out it was totally made up.
Yeah, yeah,
So, but yeah, it is a problem. Like, women are not educated enough on our bodies. Men are clearly not educated on our bodies a
yeah,
lot of the time. Um, and I feel like maybe as a society, we need to do a little better with the education there just for health and safety purposes. It doesn't necessarily have to be sex ed, but it could be part of, physical education or biology, just to know about these body systems to keep you safe and healthy.
yeah. I was fortunate. I went to a Catholic high school, And it was actually a religion class in Catholic high school. We had to take a quarter of sex ed. It
Oh,
was taught
wow.
by a Catholic priest, and it wasn't about how to have sex.
Yeah.
And what it was about, though, is here's the anatomy. And here's the
Hmm.
differences of boys and girls. I remember very specifically on test having to draw the female anatomy, draw the male anatomy. So we understood the differences and we talked about ovulatory cycles. It was a good health based anatomy class. It wasn't
Yeah.
a here's how to have sex, here's how to be homosexual or any of those types of
Right.
things. It was about here's how to
God.
be healthy with your body.
Yeah. See, that's the kind of sex ed health class that I saw on TV as a kid, like on the Wonder Years.
Yeah.
Right. But when I got to sex ed, it was let's talk about AIDS and safe sex and all this stuff. And it was weird. Like one year, we had to take it multiple grades. And one year we had a guy who was really weird and told us that like he had a crush on the head cheerleader and that, oh, well, she had sex with her boyfriend, got pregnant. Now she is barefoot and pregnant. And it was like, this doesn't feel right. And then the next class was talking about STDs and then showed us a video of a woman having like giving birth. And it was like, there's a lot of mixed messages here.
Yeah.
None
Yeah.
of them feel like they're really covering the issue. So it was strange. We in elementary school did have one person come in and talk to the girls and boys separately about puberty. Um, but it wasn't really here's how it could impact your health and taking care of yourself and explaining the cycle. It was just this will happen to your body. It is normal. Here is a sanitary napkin. Like,
Yeah.
oh, okay.
Yeah,
So,
that's kind of funny. In sixth grade, that's kind of what we had. We had, all right, it was a small school, and this was before the Catholic high school. This was a small public school, and it was the head football coach. Basically, got all the boys in the locker room. Guys, don't masturbate. Girls are going to have periods, and you got to be conscientious. Let's go have a donut. That was pretty much it. So,
yeah, it's really strange. I get that it's taboo and not everybody wants to talk about it, and a lot of parents want to have that talk themselves with their kids. But I think by the time you're getting to middle school, high school, and all of these kids either are going through puberty or have gone through puberty, it might be a good idea to, especially in terms of like PE and physical health, just talking to them in how to maintain like a healthy body with all of these changes.
yeah,
So,
yeah, it's huge because again, part of it. I mean, yeah, there is just keeping your body clean, right, and
hmm.
using deodorant, those types of things. Those are part of health, and people don't really have a
Yeah.
problem with that. And this
Yeah.
goes along with that. The other thing, when I was in high school, my parents had to go once a week to a class that was basically they were going over what the children were being taught.
Oh,
And so,
wow.
I mean, the school did it well. The school did it really well. I would say that's probably what a sex ed from a health ed standpoint should be. Um,
Absolutely.
and that was back in the early 80s. So, the pattern's been there for a long time.
Yeah.
And again, we weren't being preached to about doctrine for any specific
Hmm.
religion. We were just taught here's your body, here's the woman's body, here's the health concerns you might have.
Yeah.
It was handled very, very well.
Yeah. I wish it was more like that instead of all of this weird information about like kinks and stuff that it has become now.
Yeah,
It's it's strange and unhelpful, I think.
yeah.
Um,
Well, here
we've
in
seen,
Nebraska, sorry, a couple years ago, they were trying to propose a new health education curriculum. And part of the health education curriculum was on, the benefits of puberty blockers. And yeah,
ooh,
that, that, that was just
that
ridiculous
had
that
to
they
have
were,
been a short class.
yeah,
um, I, I I covered this in a video I did with Zach a while back about how it doesn't seem like putting anyone on puberty blockers, quote unquote, is healthy at all and seems to cause a lot of health issues down the line because I put it this way. I just watched the video again today. It's like trying to squeeze a bottle of toothpaste while the cap's still on.
yeah,
Like it's your body's still trying to go through these natural processes because it's part of aging. You're coded through your body to do
yeah,
that. Again, whether you believe it's divine or just through evolution or both.
yeah,
Um, I don't personally feel like one is mutually exclusive of the other, but you're just your body's trying to do these processes, and part of it's still going to come out of that tube.
Yeah.
Whether you have the kappa, it's just going to come out all weird and it's going to make a mess. So yeah, it's, I don't like all of this puberty blocker pushing, because these drugs are not even approved for the thing they're being prescribed for necessarily. And even for precocious puberty, I don't necessarily agree with it. It's very mixed. It's very
Yeah.
mixed with endocrinologists, as far as my research has come up with. So yeah, I don't know. Would you say that you've seen much of that in your I mean, it would have to be like really rare, but have you seen any of it in your research?
So, I haven't done any research myself on puberty blockers, but looking at some of the previous research that's been done on puberty blockers, and again, there's not a lot. Um, but some of the things looking at it is it doesn't erase the differences between boys and girls in terms of muscle mass or
Mm-hmm.
in terms of bone mineral density. Yes, if you put a boy on puberty blockers, he won't develop as much muscle mass as he would have, but it still doesn't give him female levels of muscle mass.
Right.
And then the thing that I think is so interesting is there's been a couple of different studies looking at this over the course of, say, 8 years, going on puberty blockers and then puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. So growth is stunted during those years of just puberty blockers. But then
Mm-hmm.
once the kid goes on cross-sex hormones, their growth accelerates. And so by the time they're an adult, they've attained normal adult body height for their sex. So the
Mm-hmm.
boys are getting normal male adult body height, and the girls are getting normal adult female body height. And
Right.
so it's the puberty blockers kind of hold things down, but then the cross-sex hormones, kind of like you said, now, life finds a way and pushes through, and you're going to grow as tall as your genes say you're supposed to grow.
Right. Yeah. It's I really don't like that these studies are even being conducted, because on the one hand they're necessary, but on the other hand it means that unfortunately some people have gone through this and have been the guinea pigs. And it it's people's lives, it's people's bodies, and it's their reality. And again, going back to sports, like, bodies, it's you get one and you're
Yeah.
start to pump all kinds of nonsense into it, and it's really not good for you long term.
Yeah. Yeah, and I wish I could remember who it was. I follow her on Twitter. That really put out some really interesting questions. That during puberty, there's all sorts of growth in your brain going along with psychological and social development and all that stuff. And if we're inhibiting puberty, we have no idea what that is doing
Right.
to mental, emotional, social maturation.
Right.
It sure doesn't look like it's going to be good. If you just look at
Yeah.
it logically of all the growth that happens because of puberty in the brain, and then to put that on pause for a little while all your peers
Hmm.
around you are going through those emotional developmental phases, and you're not, that just doesn't seem like a recipe for positive outcomes.
Right. We've seen impacts to executive function and things like that, and it just doesn't look like it's beneficial at all, really. So it definitely impairs judgment and stuff. So it doesn't make me feel good. I don't like this whole thing. I don't like it.
Yeah.
But that's why we do this, right? So
Yep.
that we can try to stop it, and or at least mitigate it as much as possible.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And help inform people, let people know,
absolutely.
one, these things are happening, and two, how it's going to impact their daughters or their
Right.
children or their grandchildren or their nieces or nephews or wives or whatever.
Right. Absolutely. And again, I have to thank you for your time here today, and for the testimony that you've given in the past for different states fighting to protect the integrity of sports. Because I don't know, I have a 14-month-old daughter right now. She might want to go into sports one day, and
Mhm.
hopefully it will be fair and balanced competition, because people like you help protect women's rights and women's spaces in sports. So,
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate the time to be here. I've enjoyed talking with you. And I hope that your daughter is able to play sports with the
thank
other
you.
girls, knowing it's fair competition. There's a lot of great things that come from sports. There really are. And having fair competition is a reasonable expectation for sports.
Absolutely. It should be for every sport, every category.
Yep,
So,
absolutely.
but thank you again so much for joining us. And thank you all for watching.